Some lessons arrive loudly: a lost job, an empty account, a bill that arrives 3 weeks before the money does. But the most dangerous financial traps of all, they arrive quietly, dressed as convenience, dressed as progress, dressed as one small, reasonable decision that costs almost nothing. Almost. Walter Briggs had already survived the crash of 1929. He had already filled 11 pages of a blue notebook with everything his family spent, saved, and sacrificed. But the hardest part wasn't starting. The hardest part was what came next, because the world was about to make staying disciplined feel completely unnecessary, and most people believed it. By 1931, something had shifted on Elm Street. Not the poverty, that had deepened, quietly, the way cold deepens in a house with thin walls. But something else, a mood, a collective exhaustion with being careful that was beginning to express itself in strange ways. Stores were offering easier terms. Newspapers carried advertisements with language that felt almost generous. Own it today. Pay when you can. The words were soft, inviting, designed by people who understood that a tired man reads differently than a rested one. Walter noticed it the way he noticed most things now, through the ledger. The numbers around him were changing. Neighbors were acquiring things, new things, things that appeared in parlor windows and on kitchen counters without any visible source of funding. He said nothing about it publicly, but he opened the brown ledger one evening and wrote a single word at the top of a fresh page: caution. Not fear, not judgment, just caution, because Walter had learned something in 2 years of quiet tracking that no advertisement could unlearn for him. Convenience always has a price. The only question is when you find out what it is. The sign in Dalton's window had changed again. Walter stood on the pavement longer than he meant to. The radio, his radio, the one he had saved 14 weeks for, had been replaced in the display by something newer, larger, a floor-standing model with a polished wood cabinet and a dial that glowed amber in the dark. $22. Beside it, the card, $4 down, $2 monthly. He did the arithmetic without thinking, the way the ledger had trained him to do arithmetic without thinking. $4 down, $2 every month, 11 months of payments, total cost $26 for a $22 radio. $4 paid for the privilege of not waiting. A younger Walter, the Walter of 1928, before the blue notebook, would have walked inside immediately, would have told himself $2 a month was nothing, would have carried that radio home that same evening, feeling like he had won something. This Walter stood on the pavement a moment longer, then kept walking. Not because he was noble, not because he was rigid, but because the ledger had shown him something that sign never would. What a purchase costs and what a purchase costs are not always the same number. His neighbor Frank Delaney bought the floor-standing radio in March. Walter heard it through the shared wall on a Saturday evening, something warm and orchestral drifting through the plaster. Frank's wife laughed at something the announcer said. One of the children shouted. The house sounded full and easy and unbothered. Walter sat at his kitchen table with the brown ledger open. The numbers were steady, not exciting, not dramatic, steady. He thought about Frank's radio, about the amber dial glowing in the dark, about how ordinary happiness sounds when it comes through a wall. Then he looked at the ledger again. February's emergency fund intact, the repair column manageable, the wants envelope growing slowly towards something Ruth had mentioned once and never mentioned again, because she was the kind of woman who mentioned things only once. The wool coat, soft gray, belted at the waist. Walter made a small note in the margin. Not an expense, not yet, a reminder. Because the ledger had taught him that the difference between a want and a when is almost always just time, and the willingness to hold the question open a little longer than feels comfortable. Frank's radio played something beautiful that night. Walter listened through the wall and felt, quietly and without guilt, entirely at peace with the silence of his own parlor. The sign in Dalton's window had changed. Walter noticed it on a Wednesday morning in March. The radio, the same small tabletop model he had been watching for months, now had a new card propped beside it. $1 weekly. He stopped walking entirely. $1 weekly. He could manage that. Almost anyone could manage that. That was the quiet genius of it, breaking a large number into something that felt harmless, something that didn't require patience or a back-page envelope or 14 weeks of Saturday balancing. Just $1, starting now. He stood there longer than he meant to. Installment purchasing had been growing steadily through the 1920s, commonly offered by furniture stores, appliance dealers, and now electronics shops. Many families embraced it without hesitation. It felt modern, it felt accessible, it felt like progress. Walter walked into the store. He looked at the radio up close for the first time, turned the dial once, heard the crackle of something distant and warm coming through the speaker. Then he thought about the notebook. Not dramatically, not with great moral resolve, simply he thought about it. The wants column, the back envelope, the number he had written in that corner and circled once. He did the arithmetic quietly in his head. $1 weekly for 14 weeks was $14. His envelope had $11.40. He was 3 weeks away. He thanked the man behind the counter politely and left. He did not feel noble. He felt something quieter than that. He felt certain. By spring of 1930, Walter had filled nearly 2 notebooks. He hadn't planned for 2. He had simply run out of pages in the first and walked back to Harmon's drugstore for another. Same blue cover, same ruled pages, 12 cents. He transferred nothing from the old notebook to the new one. He didn't need to. He had begun to remember things without writing them down first. That quiet shift from recording to anticipating was something he hadn't expected and couldn't quite explain. But the pattern had become familiar enough that certain expenses announced themselves before they arrived. He knew roughly when the coal would run low. He knew which weeks Ruth's grocery column would stretch. He knew the months that historically asked more of the family than others. The notebook had not taught him these things directly. It had simply held still long enough for him to see them. One evening, he flipped back through the old notebook, not looking for anything specific, and stopped at a page from the previous August, a small recurring expense, modest enough that he hadn't questioned it at the time, a weekly amount, regular as a heartbeat. He sat with it. Then he checked September, October, November. There it was, every week, quietly, consistently, reliably, spending money on something that had long since stopped serving any clear purpose in the household. He brought it to Ruth the next Saturday. She looked at the entries, counted them herself. "We've been doing that for 14 months, she said. Walter nodded. Neither of them had noticed, because before the notebook, there had been nothing to notice with. There was a stationery shop on Merchant's Row that Walter had walked past for years without entering. He went in for the first time on a Saturday morning in April. The smell hit him immediately. Ink and paper and something woody underneath. Cedar shelving, perhaps, or the lacquered display cases along the far wall. It was a particular smell the kind that belongs only to certain places and cannot be manufactured or replicated. The shop owner, a thin man named Archibald, who wore his glasses low on his nose, moved quietly behind the counter, arranging things with the careful attention of someone who understood that objects mattered. Walter looked around slowly. Notebooks of every weight, ledger books with cloth spines, composition pads, journals bound in dark green and burgundy, pencils in dozens, pens arranged by nib width in shallow velvet-lined trays. He picked up a ledger book near the center display, heavier than his blue notebook, proper ruled columns already printed, date, description, debit, credit, balance. The cover was dark brown, the pages cream-colored and thick. He opened it, turned a few pages. There was something about holding it that felt like a commitment, not a burden, a commitment. Many who maintained financial records in that era often used dedicated ledger books precisely because the physical weight of the object itself reinforced the seriousness of the practice. A nickel notebook could be discarded without much feeling. A proper ledger book, something you paid real money for, something with heft, asked something of you in return. Walter bought the ledger, $1.15. He carried it carefully, almost the way you carry something you already know will matter. Consider two men. The first, call him Arthur, works a manufacturing floor in Cleveland, Ohio. The year is 1924. He earns $28 a week. He has a wife, a child, a rented house, and a list of expenses that arrives faster than his wages do. He worries about coal in winter, about the landlord on the first of every month, about whether the shoes his son is wearing will make it through spring. He carries his money in an envelope. When the envelope is light, the week feels long. The second, call him Daniel, works in logistics coordination in Columbus, Ohio. The year is 2026. He earns a reasonable salary that sounds comfortable until the month is tallied. He has a partner, 2 children, a mortgage, and 17 subscription services he signed up for across 8 years and mostly no longer thinks about. He worries about the credit card statement, about the car payment timing, about whether the account will clear before the automatic withdrawal hits. He carries his money in a phone. When the balance is low, the week feels identical. Arthur and Daniel never met. They lived 100 years apart. But sit with both of their lives for a moment. The envelope and the banking app are different objects serving an identical anxiety. The coal bill and the utility autopay are different mechanisms producing the same quiet dread. The landlord's knock and the mortgage notification carry the same weight, dressed in different centuries. What Arthur reached for was a notebook. What Daniel reaches for, more often than is useful, is the same phone that created the problem. Neither man is careless, neither man is foolish. Both men simply needed something to help them see. The pipe burst on a Thursday night in late November. Walter heard it first, a sound like something giving up beneath the kitchen floor. By the time he reached the basement stairs, water was already moving across the cement in a thin, dark sheet, catching the lamplight from above. Ruth stood at the top of the stairs, holding a candle. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The plumber came Friday morning, looked at the damage with the particular expression of a man calculating while appearing to simply observe. $4.80, he said, finally. Maybe $5, depending on the fitting. Walter nodded slowly. $5 was nearly a week's wages. It was not a small number. It was the kind of number that, a year earlier, would have required borrowing from someone, a brother-in-law, a neighbor, a man at the plant who kept small sums for exactly this kind of Thursday night. Walter went upstairs. He opened the brown ledger. He turned to the back section, the pages he had quietly been building for 8 months. Not the wants envelope, that was separate. These were the emergency entries, small surpluses, noted and set aside on the Saturdays when the numbers balanced better than expected. He added them. $4.60. He needed perhaps 5. He checked the wants envelope. The radio money, $11.40, now grown to $12.20, with one additional deposit. He sat with that for a moment. Then he moved the necessary amount without ceremony, repaid the radio fund the following month, as he had promised himself he would. The pipe was fixed by Friday afternoon. No borrowing, no letter to the brother-in-law, no conversation he would have preferred not to have. Just a ledger that had been quietly preparing for a Thursday night it had no way of predicting. By the autumn of 1932, Walter had filled 4 ledgers. He kept them on the same shelf above the icebox, spines facing out. The blue notebook first, worn, slightly water-stained from that November pipe incident. Then 3 brown ledgers, increasingly filled with a handwriting that had grown noticeably steadier over the years, less hurried, more deliberate. He was not wealthy. This is important to say plainly, without softening it or framing it as a temporary condition on the way to something grander. Walter Briggs earned $31 a week in 1929, and he earned $31 a week in 1932. The Depression had not taken his job, but it had taken any possibility of advancement. The number on his pay envelope had not changed. What had changed was quieter than a number. He no longer felt the particular tightening in his chest that used to arrive with the first of the month. Not because the bills had become smaller, they hadn't, but because the bills were no longer surprises. They were entries he had been watching approach from a distance, like weather you've learned to read before it arrives. Ruth had noticed it before he had. "You sleep differently," she said one evening, not looking up from her mending. Walter considered that. "How so?" She said, "You put something down." He didn't have an answer for that, but he thought about it for days afterward, turning it quietly the way he turned figures in the ledger, looking for what it actually meant. 3 years had not made him rich. 3 years had made him, for the first time in his adult life, unafraid of Monday morning. That was not nothing. That was, in its own way, everything. Not everyone who started a ledger kept one. Walter knew this because he had seen it happen twice on his own street. The first was a man named Garrett, younger than Walter by perhaps 8 years, recently married, full of the particular enthusiasm of someone who has just discovered an idea and believes the discovery itself is most of the work. Garrett came to Walter one Sunday afternoon in 1931 asking about the notebooks. Walter explained the system simply. Garrett listened carefully, nodded several times, and left looking determined. 3 weeks later, Walter asked him how it was going. Garrett made a face. "I fell behind," he said, "missed 4 days in the second week. Then it felt wrong to continue without filling in what I'd missed, so I kept meaning to go back and fix it, and then—" He trailed off in the way people trail off when the ending embarrasses them slightly. The ledger was in a drawer somewhere. He wasn't sure which one. Walter recognized the mistake immediately, because he had nearly made it himself in the first month. The error was perfectionism wearing the clothes of responsibility. The belief that a missed day corrupted the record, that an incomplete week was a failed week, that the notebook required a flawless commitment or none at all. It didn't. A ledger with gaps was still a ledger. An honest record of most weeks is still worth more than an empty page representing all of them. Walter told Garrett simply, "Find the drawer, write today's date, start from now." Many people today abandon budgeting apps for the identical reason. One missed week becomes a reason to delete the app entirely. The record was never the point. The attention was. The second person Walter watched struggle was closer to home. His younger brother Edmund had started a ledger in early 1930, shortly after visiting the Briggs house one Saturday evening and watching the family's balancing ritual from across the kitchen table. Edmund was methodical by nature, more so than Walter even. He had a head for numbers and a natural tidiness that expressed itself in everything, from his handwriting to the way he arranged his workbench. His ledger was immaculate. Walter saw it once and felt a quiet admiration. Every entry dated precisely, every column summed correctly, margins clean, categories consistent, the kind of record a bookkeeper would have respected. But 6 months in, Edmund sat across from Walter at the kitchen table and said something unexpected. "It isn't working," he said flatly. Walter looked up. "What isn't?" "The notebook. I write everything down, every single thing, and then on Saturday I look at the numbers and I think, yes, that seems right, and then the next week is exactly the same." He paused. "Nothing changes." Walter was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, "What do you do after you look at the numbers?" Edmund blinked. "I close the book." There it was, the second common mistake, more subtle than Garrett's, more difficult to correct because it wore the appearance of diligence. Edmund was recording faithfully, but he was not reflecting. He was treating the Saturday review as a completion rather than a conversation. The ledger showed him everything, and he acknowledged it and moved on, unchanged. Tracking without reflection is just accounting. It produces accurate records of a life that isn't shifting. Walter told his brother, "Next Saturday, before you close the book, ask it one question, just one. What am I willing to change this week that I wasn't willing to change last week?" Edmund was quiet for a long time. "That's a harder question than addition," he said finally. "Yes," Walter said, "it is."